Hello and welcome back to Storytime History. Let me ask you something. What if I told you there once was a man so wealthy that when he traveled across the desert, entire cities felt the weight of his gold for years afterward? A ruler whose name became legend not because of war or conquest, but because of sheer, unbelievable wealth that people still struggle to comprehend even today. Stay with me because this story isn't just about gold. It's about power, faith, ambition, and a journey that shook the medieval world to its core. And if you enjoy stories like this, hidden histories, forgotten empires, and legendary lives, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, picture West Africa in the early 1300s. The Sahara Desert stretches endlessly, like a golden sea of sand. Caravans move slowly across it, carrying salt, ivory, and gold. And at the heart of it all rises one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen, the Mali Empire. This was not a small kingdom. It was vast, rich beyond imagination, stretching across lands that today are part of Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, and beyond. And it was built on something the medieval world craved more than almost anything else: gold. But even in a land of immense wealth, there was one man who would become a symbol of abundance so extreme that history itself paused to remember him. His name was Mansa Musa, and before he became the name whispered in awe across continents, he was just a prince in a powerful empire, living in the shadow of kings, surrounded by politics, ambition, and uncertainty. No one could have guessed that this quiet royal figure would one day set off on a journey so extraordinary that it would destabilize economies, astonish scholars, and turn him into one of the most legendary figures in human history. But to understand Mansa Musa, we need to understand the world that shaped him. In the Mali Empire, power was not just inherited, it was tested. Kings rose and fell through struggle, alliances, and sometimes betrayal. Gold flowed through the land, but so did tension. Trade routes connected Africa to North Africa and the Middle East, making Mali a crucial hub in a global network of wealth and knowledge. And somewhere in this world, a young Musa was being prepared for a destiny he did not yet fully understand. He wasn't the first in line for the throne. In fact, early accounts suggest he was something closer to a deputy ruler, entrusted with governing while the emperor went on long expeditions. That role, quiet, administrative, often overlooked, would turn out to be the very training ground that shaped one of history's most famous rulers. Because while others chased glory in battle, Musa learned something different. He learned how empires functioned, how trade worked, how gold moved across deserts and seas, how faith bound people together across thousands of miles. And most importantly, he learned patience. But destiny rarely announces itself gently. One day, the Emperor of Mali, Abu Bakr II, made a decision that would change everything. He became obsessed with what lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean. Some stories say he believed there was land across the sea. Others say he simply wanted to explore the unknown. Either way, he launched an ambitious voyage, sending hundreds of ships into the ocean, and never returned. And just like that, the throne was left empty. An empire this large could not remain leaderless for long. The court needed stability. The trade networks needed direction. The people needed a ruler who understood both the wealth of Mali and the fragile balance that kept it all together. And so, Mansa Musa was chosen to lead. At first, he may not have realized the full weight of what had been placed upon him. He was stepping into a role that would not only define his life, but reshape how the world saw Africa itself. Because under his rule, Mali would not just be rich. It would become legendary. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It began quietly, with decisions made in council rooms, with gold weighed in careful hands, with caravans stretching across deserts like moving cities. And soon, Mansa Musa would set his empire on a path that would lead him far beyond the borders of his homeland, toward a journey that would shock the entire medieval world. A journey that started with faith and ended with a legend. And that is where our story truly begins. When Mansa Musa took the throne around 1312, the Mali Empire was already rich, but what he did with that foundation would take it into an entirely different category of history. He wasn't just a ruler sitting on a throne. He was a strategist, a builder, A man who understood that wealth without structure can disappear just as quickly as it appears. And Mali had wealth in abundance. Deep in the earth lay gold fields so productive that they became the backbone of the medieval world economy. Across the Sahara, salt mines produced a resource just as valuable as gold itself in many regions. Salt preserved food, sustained life, and became a currency of survival. Mansa Musa controlled both. But control wasn't enough. He wanted stability, growth, and legacy, so he strengthened trade routes, ensuring caravans could move safely across the desert. He supported cities like Timbuktu and Gao, turning them into centers of commerce and learning. Scholars, traders, and artisans began to flow into Mali, drawn by opportunity and protection. And as wealth grew, so did reputation. Stories of Mali's riches began to spread far beyond Africa. In North Africa, merchants spoke of a king who owned so much gold that it was treated almost casually within his court. In the Middle East, whispers grew of a kingdom where gold was so common that it lost its sense of rarity. But Mansa Musa wasn't interested in rumors. He was focused on something deeper: faith. As a devout Muslim, he saw himself not just as a king, but as a servant of God. And in his heart, there was one journey that every able Muslim aspired to make at least once in their life: the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. For Musa, this wasn't just a spiritual duty. It was also a chance to place Mali firmly on the map of the wider Islamic world, to show that his empire was not isolated in West Africa, but deeply connected to the heart of global civilization. And so, he began preparing what would become one of the most famous journeys in human history. But this was no ordinary pilgrimage. Mansa Musa didn't travel alone. He didn't travel lightly. He traveled like a king who ruled an empire of unimaginable wealth. Caravans were assembled that stretched across the horizon. Thousands of attendants were gathered. Camels carried not just supplies, but gold. Gold in astonishing quantities. So much gold that it wasn't just wealth, it was almost like carrying the weight of an entire economy on the move. But even before the journey began, there was a sense that something historic was about to unfold. Because when a man like Mansa Musa moves, the world doesn't just watch. It changes. And as the caravan prepared to leave Mali, heading toward the vast unknown of the Sahara Desert, few could have predicted just how deeply this journey would ripple across continents, or how one man's act of devotion would reshape the economy of an entire region. The desert awaited, and so did history. The journey to Mecca began like something out of a dream or a warning. Imagine thousands of people moving together across the vast Sahara Desert. Camels loaded with gold, servants carrying silk and provisions, scholars and advisors walking beside soldiers who ensured safety along the route. It wasn't just a caravan. It was a moving city made of wealth, faith, and ambition. As Mansa Musa's procession crossed into North Africa, towns that had never seen anything like it before were stunned into silence. People came out to the edges of cities just to watch. Because this wasn't just a king passing through. This was a statement. Everywhere he stopped, Mansa Musa distributed gold. Not small amounts, not symbolic gifts, but large, generous, almost overwhelming quantities. To the people he met, it felt like endless wealth had arrived from the desert itself. In some places, he gave so much away that local economies began to feel the impact immediately. And at the time, he likely saw it as generosity, a reflection of faith, a demonstration of gratitude to God. But history has a strange way of reacting to generosity on that scale. The caravan continued north through the scorching desert and into the bustling cities of North Africa. And eventually it reached Cairo. Cairo was one of the greatest cities in the medieval world. A hub of trade, learning, and politics. Merchants from across continents passed through its streets. Scholars debated in its mosques. Wealth flowed constantly through its markets. But nothing prepared Cairo for what was about to happen. When Mansa Musa entered the city, he brought with him not just gold, but an entire economic shockwave. He gave freely, almost continuously, to nobles, to merchants, to the poor. Gold changed hands so rapidly and in such massive quantities that its value began to shift. What had once been precious suddenly became less rare. And the consequences were immediate. Prices began to rise. The value of gold dropped. Inflation spread through the city and lingered for years afterward. People in Cairo would remember this moment not just as a visit, but as an event that disrupted their entire economy. But Mansa Musa didn't stay long enough to witness the full effect. His journey continued toward Mecca, toward the fulfillment of his pilgrimage, toward a spiritual milestone that had driven him across deserts and into history. And yet, without intending to, he had already made history in a very different way. Because word of his wealth didn't stay in Cairo. Traveled. Fast. And soon, the entire known world would hear of the king who carried gold like dust in his hands. But the story of Mansa Musa was far from over. In fact, what he would do after this journey might be even more important than the journey itself. By the time Mansa Musa completed his pilgrimage and began the journey back toward Mali, something had changed, not just in him, but in how the world saw him. In Mecca, he had fulfilled his spiritual duty, surrounded by rulers, scholars, and pilgrims from across the Islamic world. But now he had something else: reputation. A reputation that was spreading faster than any caravan could travel. The stories coming out of Cairo alone were enough to turn him into a figure of fascination. Merchants spoke of him in disbelief. Scholars tried to calculate the scale of his wealth and failed. And travelers carried his name across deserts, seas, and cities. Mansa Musa had become more than a king. He had become a legend in motion. But what he did next would ensure that legacy lasted far beyond his lifetime. Instead of simply returning home and enjoying his empire's wealth, Mansa Musa began investing in it on a massive scale. He understood something crucial: wealth is powerful, but knowledge is lasting. And so, when he returned to Mali, he turned his attention toward building cities, not just for trade, but for learning, culture, and religion. Timbuktu, in particular, began to rise under his influence. What had once been a modest trading town began transforming into a center of scholarship. Mosques were built. Libraries expanded. Scholars were invited from across the Islamic world, North Africa, the Middle East, even beyond, to come and teach. Books became treasures. Knowledge became currency. And Mali became a place where ideas traveled as freely as gold once had. One of the most famous institutions associated with this era was the Sankore Mosque and University. It became a place where theology, mathematics, astronomy, and law were studied with intensity and respect. Manuscripts were copied by hand. Discussions lasted late into the night. And a culture of learning began to flourish in a region many outside Africa had barely understood before. Mansa Musa wasn't just building buildings. He was building identity. He was showing the world that West Africa was not isolated or forgotten, but deeply connected to global civilization. And for a time, it worked. Mali became known not only for its gold, but for its intellect, its culture, and its ambition. But even great empires carry the seeds of change within them, because after Mansa Musa, leadership would not remain as stable. Successors struggled to maintain the same level of control. Trade routes shifted. External pressures grew. And slowly, the golden age he helped create began to fade into memory. But the impact of his rule, that would not disappear. It had already been written into history, and the world was still trying to understand what it had witnessed. By the time Mansa Musa completed his pilgrimage and began the journey back toward Mali, something had changed, not just in him, but in how the world saw him. In Mecca, he had fulfilled his spiritual duty, surrounded by rulers, scholars, and pilgrims from across the Islamic world. But now he had something else: reputation. A reputation that was spreading faster than any caravan could travel. The stories coming out of Cairo alone were enough to turn him into a figure of fascination. Merchants spoke of him in disbelief. Scholars tried to calculate the scale of his wealth and failed. And travelers carried his name across deserts, seas, and cities. Mansa Musa had become more than a king. He had become a legend in motion. But what he did next would ensure that legacy lasted far beyond his lifetime. Instead of simply returning home and enjoying his empire's wealth, Mansa Musa began investing in it on a massive scale. He understood something crucial: wealth is powerful, but knowledge is lasting. And so, when he returned to Mali, he turned his attention toward building cities, not just for trade but for learning, culture, and religion. Timbuktu, in particular, began to rise under his influence. What had once been a modest trading town began transforming into a center of scholarship. Mosques were built, libraries expanded. Scholars were invited from across the Islamic world, North Africa, the Middle East, even beyond, to come and teach. Books became treasures. Knowledge became currency. And Mali became a place where ideas traveled as freely as gold once had. One of the most famous institutions associated with this era was the Sankore Mosque and University. It became a place where theology, mathematics, astronomy, and law were studied with intensity and respect. Manuscripts were copied by hand. Discussions lasted late into the night. And a culture of learning began to flourish in a region many outside Africa had barely understood before. Mansa Musa wasn't just building buildings. He was building identity. He was showing the world that West Africa was not isolated or forgotten, but deeply connected to global civilization. And for a time, it worked. Mali became known not only for its gold, but for its intellect, its culture, and its ambition. But even great empires carry the seeds of change within them, because after Mansa Musa, leadership would not remain as stable. Successors struggled to maintain the same level of control. Trade routes shifted. External pressures grew. And slowly, the golden age he helped create began to fade into memory. But the impact of his rule, that would not disappear. It had already been written into history, and the world was still trying to understand what it had witnessed. Mansa Musa's life eventually came to an end in the mid-1330s, though even the exact details of his death are wrapped in the quiet uncertainty of medieval history. What remains clear, however, is what he left behind. An empire that once stood at the center of global wealth. A pilgrimage that reshaped economies across continents. And a legacy that still echoes through history books, classrooms, and stories told centuries later. But here is what makes his story truly remarkable. Mansa Musa didn't conquer the world with armies. He didn't leave behind massive monuments of war or destruction. Instead, his impact came through movement, through trade, through faith, through generosity, and through the flow of gold and knowledge across borders. His famous journey to Mecca became one of the most documented economic events of the medieval world, remembered for its extraordinary impact on Cairo's economy and its astonishing display of wealth. And yet, beyond the gold, his most lasting contribution may have been the cultural and intellectual rise of Mali during his reign. Timbuktu became a symbol of learning and scholarship. West Africa became more closely tied to the Islamic world. And the idea of Africa in global history gained a new dimension, one that cannot be ignored or simplified. Of course, myths grew around him over time. Stories became larger with each retelling. But even when we separate legend from fact, what remains is still extraordinary. A king who ruled one of the richest empires of his time. A pilgrim whose journey stunned the medieval world. And a leader whose legacy continues to reshape how we understand global history. So when we talk about Mansa Musa today, we are not just talking about gold. We are talking about vision. We are talking about a moment in history when one man's life connected deserts, cities, empires, and cultures across continents. And maybe that is why his story still captivates us centuries later. Because it reminds us that history is not just about battles or borders. Sometimes, it is about a man crossing a desert with so much wealth that the world itself had to adjust. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Mansa Musa's journey surprised you the most? And as always, we'll see you in the next story.